Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having me. Thank you, Professor Martinez, for inviting me to speak today. My name is Sahar Martinez. I am a licensed marriage and family therapist and a doctor of psychology, and I'm here to talk to you all about race, ethnicity, and mental health. So I wanted to share a little bit about me before we jump into the lecture. I am a licensed therapist in the state of California. I'm the founder of a group therapy practice called the Process Wellness Collective. We are a group of licensed and pre-licensed clinicians that work from a anti-racist, anti-oppressive lens. I started the process not with the intention of having a group practice. It just kind of honestly fell into my lap. I was taking on associates, which are pre-licensed clinicians, and they were working under my supervision, and we grew very quickly. And I realized that there was a need here to have a space for like-minded clinicians to come together where we could work in support of one another, and we could be in community. Being in private practice can be very isolating, especially if you're working on your own. And I knew that I didn't want to work in isolation, and I knew that I wanted to be able to provide support for pre-licensed clinicians in a way that was both created financial stability for them, because that's a whole different conversation on how pre-licensed clinicians are taken advantage of in the system. But I wanted to have a space where they were paid and they could have a livable wage and do the work that they love to do, but also have support for both our pre-licensed clinicians and our licensed clinicians to not feel so alone in the work. So yeah, that is kind of the very short story of how the process was founded. In addition to doing my clinical work, I'm also adjunct faculty at two local universities in Orange County, where I teach in the Department of Physical Therapy and in the Department of Couple and Family Therapy. And I teach courses like diversity and psychology of healthcare, couples therapy, group therapy, practicum, and kind of whatever else they throw at me. I also am an AAMFT approved supervisor, and kind of what this means is that I got an extra certificate from our professional organization that allows me to supervise at accredited universities for pre-licensed clinicians who are at the beginning of their training. And then I'm certified in a few different modalities, including internal family systems, somatic attachment, brain spotting, ketamine assisted therapy, and perinatal mental health. These certifications that I hold, they all really attend to what my clinical interests are, which is working in the perinatal community, working with couples and relationships, and working with communities of color. Internal family systems is the modality that I use most often. And what it essentially is the idea or the concept that we all hold like this internal system of parts that are informed by our lived experiences. And what I have found is that when working with diverse populations, there are so many different parts of us that we have because of the intersection of the identities that we hold. And IFS has been a really beautiful connecting point in the therapeutic work that I do. This is also a part of my history. I am the daughter of immigrants. My parents immigrated to America from Iran when my mom was 13 and my dad was in his 30s, I believe. They obviously were not together at the time they met here, but it's a really big part of my identity, and it's a really big part of who I am, is being connected to and celebrating my culture and where my family comes from. I'm also married to Professor Martinez's brother, and so we are a mixed ethnic family. And that is also really important in how we raise our kids. These are our kids. I am the first generation in my family of origin to receive higher education, and that is like a real point of pride for my parents and for me. But that was something that was really important, and a lot of messaging that we heard growing up was to make sure you get an education, and we came here so that you guys had access to education and, you know, all this stuff. I'm a native Farsi speaker. I spoke Farsi before I spoke English. I didn't speak English till I was like the age of 4. And my culture of origin is Iranian, and that is considered a collectivistic culture. And what that means is that we consider the needs of the community over the needs of the individual. And that is very much like embodied in who I am as in my personal life and in my professional life. It's also like probably part of the reason why I founded the process was like that need for community in my daily life in all aspects, not just at home, but also at work. I have experienced generational trauma, and I am diagnosed with inattentive ADHD, generalized anxiety disorder, and panic disorder. And it's important for me to let you guys know that because this is part of the intersectionality of my lived experience. I'm diagnosed with these things and I'm medicated for these things. And that is something that held a lot of stigma in my family and culture of origin, probably until this generation. And I know that that is a commonality in many communities of color where getting services and getting help and getting support for mental health specifically is often put on the back burner because it's not seen as a quote unquote real problem. These are some of my clinical interests. I mentioned earlier that I use internal family systems as my modality of choice. I also integrate ketamine assisted therapy into the work that I do. I partner with a medical organization called Journey Clinical, where they do the prescribing of the ketamine, and we do like the ketamine journey in office with clients who experience treatment resistant depression, generalized anxiety disorder, PTSD, major depressive disorder. So it's been a really profoundly impactful modality that I to use with clients, especially clients who have maybe been in therapy for a while and like the traditional talk therapy hasn't really worked for them. I've seen it be profoundly impactful for clients who experience generational trauma because a lot of times what we know is that we store trauma in our bodies, and sometimes we don't know why we feel the things that we feel. We don't know if they belong to us or if they maybe belong to our ancestors. And some of the work that ketamine does is it helps to surface those kind of pain points and really explore like the story around them and how we can start to release what our bodies are holding on to. I do all of my work from a social justice lens. I think we cannot, as therapists, as mental health professionals, as educators, we cannot really move through the world, especially right now, without looking at social justice and what's going on in the world around us and just the collective trauma that we're all experiencing based off of the political climate, climate change, things that are going on all over the world. Yeah. I also work a lot with the perinatal community, working with women and female identified folks experiencing like the preconception, pregnancy, postpartum, infertility, trying to conceive, birth trauma, kind of that whole space. And then generally that tends to lead into women's wellness. I also do a lot of work with couples and relational therapy. I work a lot with both couples and relationships that are transitioning into parenthood. I work a lot with the ethical non-monogamy and polyamorous community, and it's really, really fun work. I really enjoy it. I support a lot of clients who have like the intersection of things like the things that I mentioned above and also neurodiversity, whether that is autism, ADHD, kind of anywhere on that spectrum. And then many of my clients experience racial trauma, attachment disorders, and we focus a lot on the act of generational healing. So I know that this sounds like a lot. It's like a laundry list of things, right? But all of these things connect into one another, right? So when I work with a client who is experiencing maybe postpartum depression, I look at the factors that impact that experience, right? Where is she from? Where are her ancestors from? How does that impact how she's experiencing parenthood for the first time? What does support look like in her community? Does that help to support how she's feeling, or does it, make it worse? And so I think that it's really important when we look at our clinical interests, we look at like why we're interested in those things, but also how those things connect into one another. There are so many commonalities that I think exist within communities, even if those communities aren't the same, right? When we look at BIPOC communities, what we see oftentimes is that there are issues related to assimilation. There are shared traumas that are held. There is a prevalence in undiagnosed mental health conditions because of the stigma that mental health holds. And so I think it's really important that when we look at who we're working with, we look at the whole story of who we're working with. It's not just the person sitting in front of us, it's their whole system and what that means. So when we talk about mental health in BIPOC communities, it's really important to look at both the data that is provided, but also the gaps in the data, and to start to look at what we're missing here and what connections we can start making in order to provide support to the communities that need it most. What we know statistically is that 20% of Black adults are more likely to report serious psychological distress. And kind of the gap that we see there is, okay, so we know that when psychological distress is reported, it meets a level that is enough to call serious. And what are we missing that psychological distress is not being reported prior to it reaching an acute level? And I think that's really important, because what that tells us as providers is that there are not enough safe, trauma-informed, accessible spaces for communities of color to access when they start feeling distressed, specifically when they start feeling psychologically distressed. So what we know is that rates of depression are lower in Black and Brown communities, specifically in Black and Latinx communities. But what we see on the flip side of that is that depression in BIPOC communities is way more likely to be reported as persistent. And so we're seeing that there is a lower reporting of depression, but the depression that is being reported is oftentimes treatment-resistant depression, chronic depression, it's complex trauma. And so again, the question is that, was it always that way? Was that experience of depression always like that? Or did it develop into that because there wasn't access to care when it first presented? When we pivot to looking at the criminal justice system, what we see is that there is a disproportionately overrepresentation of BIPOC communities. And what we're also seeing is that mental and behavioral health conditions are very common amongst the people who are incarcerated. And so we look at the intersection of the people that are incarcerated, what communities they belong to, mental health conditions, and we start to see, what are the commonalities here, and how are we not serving the communities that need us most? When we look at the juvenile justice system, the statistics that we see is that 50 to 75% of the youth that are in the juvenile justice system meet criteria for mental illness. And again, we have to look at the intersectionality of being in the system, being a youth and a member of a community that is marginalized, and then meeting criteria for mental illness. And so we have to look at how those things factor in together, and if being in the system is supportive to that or is not supportive to that. And I think what we see here often is communities that are undersupported. They don't have the access to care, and they don't have access to safe care. And so they're not able to access the care because going into spaces that don't feel safe to them when they're already experiencing the lack of safety within their own bodies is not an option. Cultural competence is a really big factor in providing care that is trauma-informed and safe for diverse communities. And so when we look at the cultural incompetence of healthcare providers, what we can see is that this is likely something that is a big contributor to underdiagnosis or misdiagnosis of mental illnesses in the BIPOC community. And this can look like, cultural incompetence can look like language barriers, not knowing how to engage with different communities, not knowing what provides safety, supportiveness, trauma-informed care for those communities. And so that just increases the stigma of, you are a provider that cannot help me, and I actually don't think that I can be helped at all, right? Which then creates more of that generational impact of lack of care. What we can know is that the lack of diagnosis or the misdiagnosis and the connection to that with different communities of color is really, really impactful to how those communities are perceived by the public in general. And I think that when we consider what our assumptions are, what our own biases are, what our own internal racism looks like, we have to look at why we feel that way, and how our lack of education, our lack of understanding, and our lack of cultural competence contributes to that. So that becomes our labor to do on our end of things, to start to create spaces that are more informed, that are better informed, and that are safer for our BIPOC communities. And when we look at Native and Indigenous Americans, we see that adults in those communities have the highest reported rate of mental illnesses of any single race identifying group. The Native and Indigenous populations are probably one of the most underserved populations that we see in the US today and historically. And that's really important to know. The segregation of those communities, the lack of access to care of those communities, and the lack of safe spaces for them to access is huge. When we talk about, the impact of racism and discrimination, we have to look at, you know, how what the impact is in the communities, but also on the individuals, right? And so what we see is that in the therapist space specifically, the majority of the therapists that are working in our communities are white. 63% of pre-licensed therapists in California are white. This number jumps to 83.2% when they survey clinical licensed members. That's huge. California is an extremely diverse state. And what we're seeing is that for mental health specifically, the people who are providing care don't represent the community at large. And that is a problem. That is a huge problem because people who already have stigma, who already experience fear, who want to make sure that if they're going to access a space where they're going to be vulnerable, where they're creating generational change by even accessing the space, that space is safe for them. And what doesn't feel safe often to people is someone who doesn't understand where they're coming from, someone who doesn't know what their lived experience is, right? Someone who doesn't provide that safety net for them to come in and say, you're going to be okay here and you're going to be safe and you're going to be believed. When we look at the research on how things like racism and discrimination impact the body, what we know is that racial trauma lives in your body and it's inherited generationally, right? Epigenetics is a real thing. And so I know, like in my family of origin, my maternal grandmother, was in a very abusive relationship and experienced physical, sexual, and emotional abuse in that relationship. And that biologically changes who she is, right? So when she had my mom and my mom's sisters, there is a sense of hypervigilance that lives within them that doesn't necessarily belong to them, but because of that biological change that happened from my grandmother and her experience, that was inherited to her kids, and then her kids pass it down to their kids, which becomes like me, my sister, and my cousins. And so I give this example because I think it's important to know that, like, when you work with people who come from diverse backgrounds, who have a trauma history that maybe it spans generationally, we need to know those stories. It's important for those people to have a space to share those stories so that they can both understand why that hypervigilance lives in them, why they hold trauma in their bodies in the way that they do, and it gives them an opportunity to process it and hopefully move through it. And so I think it's really important to know that, those things exist in our bodies and they change our bodies. And when we look at communities like Black and African American communities, we know that generational race-based trauma is significant and ongoing. We know that hypervigilance that existed generations ago still exists today, and it has a reason to. And so it's not just, oh, this happened to your ancestors and you don't have to feel that way anymore. In that community specifically, in Black and African American communities specifically, that hypervigilance exists because of what's happening currently today, but also what has happened generationally, historically within that community. When we look at unaddressed racial trauma, what we know is that the lack of addressing it, the lack of talking about it, the lack of understanding it leads to significant ongoing physical and mental health challenges, both for the individual experiencing it, but for their families, for their relationships, for their communities, and beyond. So this is a community issue. This is not just my client coming in and sitting across from me. This is not just me sitting across from my therapist. Shout out to Kim, she's the best. But like, this is not just that. This is, we have to look at, okay, this is your lived experience as an individual, but how does your experience impact the experience of your family, of your friends, of your community, of your coworkers, of your partners, right? And how does that impact like what happens to them and beyond that? And I think, when we begin to have a baseline understanding of what representation can look like in any kind of helping profession, whether you are a therapist, a doctor, a PT, an OT, an educator, in any space where you are occupying, where you are providing support to other communities, what we can begin to understand is that the intersection of trauma and the lived experience is there, and we have to address it. So when we look at the impact of racial trauma specifically, what we see is that the impact of trauma based on race, it impacts the well-being across the board of BIPOC individuals. And so it is not just their emotional well-being, right? It's not just their mental health, it's their physical well-being, it's their spiritual well-being, it's the community well-being. And so what we see is that it impacts every aspect of that person's life. We see with epigenetics that it impacts people on a cellular biological level, right? It changes who they are, it changes your makeup. And so that's important to know, because a lot of times we feel like this is beyond our control. And the reality of it is, it is. It is. We're not in any position anytime soon to eliminate racial trauma. And so what we can do as providers is say, I can see how hard this is for you. I can see how you're holding this trauma in your body. And is there a way to create some internal safety for yourself, just maybe 1% more, to lessen that a little bit? And, when we look at racial trauma, we look at some of the symptoms that can present with the traumatic experience based on race. And what we see are symptoms really similar to post-traumatic stress disorder, complex post-traumatic stress disorder. And so it looks like things like distancing yourself from the traumatic event or memories. That could be avoiding physical spaces, avoiding the news, avoiding content, avoiding places, because those can oftentimes elicit a flashback or the reliving of the traumatic event, which then again becomes its own trauma. Oftentimes people who are having symptoms of racial trauma, they can feel really distracted, they can feel super irritable, hopeless, they can have low self-esteem, they can have a sense of hyperarousal or just a general feeling of lack of safety, both internally and externally, which then contributes to that like impending sense of doom and negativity. So really, this is impactful to people's, like, the entire parts of their lives, right? This is not just, oh, this is hard for me when I'm, at home by myself. This impacts their professional life, their personal life, their relationships, their communities. And so it's important to know how racial trauma can show up and what people who are experiencing it are holding in their bodies. And so in looking at both the physical impact and the emotional impact, what we see are things like headache, hypertension, chest pains, cardiovascular disease, insomnia, digestive issues, nausea, and chronic illness, right? We know the pipeline to chronic stress, from chronic stress to chronic illness, is big. We know that it's a direct connection, right? When we experience ongoing trauma, when we experience chronic stress, what we are seeing now, like what new research is showing, is that there is a direct correlation between chronic stress and autoimmune disorders. And what we see is that your body living in that state of chronic stress doesn't give it time to rest, and doesn't give it time to heal, and doesn't give it time to restore. And so at some point, your body starts to give out, and that can show up in so many different ways. But we do see a prevalence of autoimmune disorders and chronic illnesses when we see things like chronic stress, complex PTSD, which are common in communities of color. And so when we pivot and look to the emotional impact, we see a high prevalence of anxiety, depression, PTSD and CPTSD, dissociative symptoms, depersonalization, derealization, substance use and abuse, and suicidal ideation. And essentially, a lot of these, what they do is they provide these people with the opportunity to escape the experience of trauma and discrimination, right? Things like dissociative symptoms, depersonalization, derealization, substance use disorder, suicidal ideation, those are all ways to escape, right? Those are all ways to like essentially disconnect from your body and disconnect from your emotions and give yourself some space, right? Are they the healthiest ways? No. Are they a coping strategy? Absolutely. Absolutely. And so when I have a client who comes in, who sits with me and says that they experience disassociation, in the work that I do, like there is an opportunity there to give gratitude to that part of you that experiences disassociation for allowing your body to take a break, right? And then we talk about how to resource safety. And is that even an option for you? Is it an option for you to resource safety? in the experience, in your own lived experience, right? And if it is, great, let's talk about that. And if it isn't, that's also okay. Can we talk about how we can pave an avenue for that and what that might look like for you? So we can't talk about race and racism and ethnicity without also talking about intersectionality. And intersectionality essentially is a theoretical framework that describes how different forms of oppression kind of interact and connect with one another to create unique experiences for individuals. We see this in the BIPOC community, especially when we're addressing discrimination and the BIPOC experience from the lens where we're looking at intersectionality, because what we begin to see is the layered experience of the of how people live and how complex that is, right? So in my experience, it has been rare that I work with somebody who comes in and says, my experience solely exists in the space of being the child of immigrants, right? It's not. Like my experience personally exists in being someone who is the child of immigrants, who is also neurodivergent, who also exists in a female presenting body, right? And the intersection of all of those things impact how I experience the world and how the world experiences me, right? And so when we look at gender, sex, ableism, religion, socioeconomic status, what your nationality is, there's so many different experiences of intersectionality that we could list here. These are all examples of how our identities can intersect with one another and create the experience that is unique just to us, right? There's only one me. And so there might be other people who have similar identities to what I do or have the same identities to what I do, and their experience is always going to be different, right? And so that's why it's important to address this from a space of curiosity, to say, okay, these are the identities that you hold, and how do those identities impact who you are and how you live your life and how you experience the world? And so when we approach humanity from a space of curiosity, from a space of knowing that we all hold multiple identities, right? We know that addressing these issues, the issues that come up for every individual, cannot be addressed as like a single issue problem, right? So my client coming in who's experiencing racism and discrimination doesn't only exist because of the race or ethnicity that they hold. We have to look at everything that they're coming in with, right? And how their experience of racism impacts their being, right? And so we know that oppression is a layered experience. And what we know is that we have to look at all of those layers, right? Knowing that we exist as an individual, we exist as a community, maybe we exist in a community that has been marginalized or discriminated against, right? And what we know is that our experience deepens as we identify each different identity that we hold and how they interact with one another, right? How are our identities in relationship with one another? And then how does that impact who we are and what we do? And so when I work with clients, I kind of try to look at these 5 like core pillars in our work together, like towards healing, right? And the first one is always going to be trauma-informed care. And essentially what trauma-informed care includes is, can I, look at the work that I'm doing from a lens of knowing that I have to learn about you and I am not the expert here, right? It's not that your trauma is centered, but your lived experience is centered, right? And can I come from a place of curiosity? Can I come from a place of validation? Can I come from a place of learning what you need in order to resource safety and then trying to provide that for you, right? But after that comes cultural competency. So I am by no means like an expert on every culture and every race and every religion, but what I am committed to doing is learning as much as I can, in support of my clients and in support of the work that I'm doing. And so when I have a client come and sit with me, even if we share a culture and an ethnicity, I want to learn about their experience of it, right? Tell me what this looks like for you. Tell me what celebrating holidays in your household has looked like growing up, right? Tell me what your experience has been being an immigrant in this country, being in a Black or brown body in this country, living in a queer body in this country. What is it like when you experience ableism? What is it like when you experience discrimination? What is it like when you discriminate race-based trauma? I want to know what your experience is because I'm never going to assume, right? I don't want to assume. I want to learn about your experience from your lens And then I will then take the time to self-educate and still check in with you, right? Because cultural competency, we can read about it. We can read about cultures. We can read about religions. We can read about ethnicities and race. But what it comes down to is that each person's experience is individual to them. And that's the important thing to kind of, to really remind yourselves of. I take a strengths-based approach. So really what that means is let's identify the things that are working and then can we build off of that, right? We all have an internal system of strengths that work for us. And so oftentimes we'll have clients come in and they'll be like, everything is awful, nothing is working, the world is terrible. And it's like, yeah, the world is terrible and so many things are going wrong. And I'm wondering, like, when things have gone right for you, what that has felt like, right? And we're not going to dismiss or invalidate that person's lived experience, right? Right now the world sucks for them. And can they resource from a time when it has sucked less and pull from that, right? When we move from there, the impact of finding community is so, so healing and powerful, right? Knowing that we're not alone in our experiences, knowing that we have support in our healing, knowing that we have a system that we can plug into that will be there for us, right? Whether that is your therapist, your doctor, your friends, your family, your partners, your classmates, your professors, whatever that is, finding people who become your soft place to land. And then beyond that, we look at self-care, right? And self-care is not like I'm going to brunch with my friends and I'm going to get my nails done. It can be that, but really what we want to look at in terms of self-care is how are you nourishing and nurturing yourself so that you are resourced when shit really hits the fan, because it's inevitably going to, right? And that can be things like prioritizing sleep, prioritizing your therapy, making sure that you stay connected to the people that you care about, making sure that your personal hygiene is taken care of, like making sure that you have a nourishing meal that you can have, once a week, whatever that is. So knowing that caring for yourself has to be a part of this process of healing. And you get to prioritize that in ways that maybe are really healing for you, but also very hard to do because they're not part historically of your lived experience. So that's all I have for today. I would love for you guys to keep in touch. Professor Martinez did provide me with a few questions, so I'm going to answer those. I'm going to answer a few of those now. But if anything else comes up for any of you, please don't hesitate to reach out. I would love to hear from you. And I'm just like really grateful for this opportunity. So the first question I'm going to start with is, have you dealt with discrimination in your personal or professional life? If so, how does this inform your work? I have. I specifically after 9/11, I remember my parents' home was vandalized. It was like a very traumatic time for my family and my community because there was this idea that by existing, what I represented was dangerous to other people. And that at the age of, you know, 18 years old felt really dysregulating and really dysregulating and really like felt like it was taking away the stability that I had in my life. I think at the time how I dealt with it was just by trying to ignore it and not deal with it. And I know that now that experience of ignoring it really created like a hypervigilance in my own body where I've had to work on that like in my own personal therapy. And how it informs my work is I address these things head on in my work. So when like, with the inauguration that happened last month, that was a question that I asked every client who came into my door, like how that was impacting them and what that felt like for them and how they were feeling, with all of the information that was being put out there and all of the experiences that were happening and all of the changes that were happening in the government. And that holds to like whether it's the inauguration, the election, the humanitarian crisis in Gaza, like all of those things, like those are things that I address head on in my work. And I think that is really important because those are conversations that are hard to have. And oftentimes I find that people aren't having them in their personal lives because they feel so heavy or so polarizing that there is fear around bringing it up. And so I feel like therapy can be that place where you can have that conversation and it doesn't have to feel so destabilizing and it can maybe hopefully feel safe to address it there. How do you handle being a therapist, business owner, and parent? Not well. I have a lot of help. I have a really supportive partner, and I have a really supportive community in my family that lives here, and in my family that doesn't live here, that I can reach out to and connect and just say when things are really, really hard. Um, so yeah, there is no, I mean, that tells you that they have it figured out is not being honest with you. We're all just trying to figure it out. And I think that's kind of the beauty of life, is that being in that space of perpetually trying to figure it out provides us with the opportunity of always having space to grow. And that feels really, really good. Do you have a therapist? I do have a therapist. Her name is Kim. I love her. I see her every week on Wednesdays. She is my lifesaver. Her and Lexapro. Do you have any advice for future clinicians or mental health advocates? Um, my advice would be to take care of yourselves. This work is really rewarding, but really challenging. And so the only way that this work is sustainable is by caring for yourself. I know that I spent a lot of my like 20s and maybe even a little bit of my early 30s like feeling like I had to be the loudest person in the room in order to have my voice be heard. And what I've realized is that actually it can become like a deterrent to people listening to what you have to say. And so I've changed that a little bit. I'm still like really committed to my advocacy and the work that I'm doing, but I realize that I don't have to be, for me personally, I don't have to be loud about it. And that experience for me of taking up space in that way, like actually creates a lot of dysregulation in my system. And so I think it's really important to have awareness of like what it is that your system needs in order to feel regulated, and then to do more of that as you're supporting people in their healing journeys. So yeah, that's all I've got. Thank you again so much. I hope this covered any questions that you guys have, and I am, yeah, grateful for the opportunity.